Hey, New Hope, Pastor Tommy here, back from vacation, tanned, rested, and ready to go. Samuel and Irwin did a great job while we were gone. Many people have asked what we did while we were gone. Judy and I went to Arizona. We'd never really spent much time there, and so we stayed in a friend's house for several days. We went to several zoos. Many of you know I'm a big fan of zoos, and went, of course, to the Grand Canyon and saw a bunch of friends. And since it was me, frankly, we listened to 3 audiobooks while we were on the road. We were driving from place to place. And the 3 books we listened to were fascinating to me. The first one was entitled Rabid. And the subtitle of that was something like A Cultural History of the World's Most Diabolical Virus. And it, of course, was about rabies. And it's fascinating. I didn't realize what an impact rabies had on the history of the world, on the history of our country. There was a great chapter on vampires and werewolves, and there was an even better chapter on Louis Pasteur. I didn't realize that he was the one who came up with the vaccine for rabies. And the guys who were crazy who had to go get the rabid dog saliva. Well worth the read. The second book we listened to was Viruses, Plagues, and History. And it was basically a history of viruses and plagues by a guy's last name was Oldstone. And what I learned from that book, among other things, was that this isn't the first time that the government has been inconsistent in the way they've handled viruses and plagues. What we're going through now, we tend to think like we're the only ones who've ever experienced this. Try and be in Memphis during a yellow fever outbreak and they won't let you out of the city by gunpoint. This isn't the first time that there has been a viral pandemic in the world where politicians have used it to their advantage. This isn't the first time during a pandemic that the wealthy got wealthier. Talking to you, Mr. Amazon, right? And so it was just a good book to get a good perspective on things. And there were chapters on smallpox and chapter on AIDS or chapter on yellow fever. That was probably the best. I still have one more chapter on mad cow disease. That one really didn't, grab my attention that much. Probably the most important book we listened to on the trip was a book that Judy had already read. She wanted to listen to it again. And it was entitled The Beautiful Community by a Black PCA, Presbyterian Church in America pastor named Irwin, Ince. And the subtitle of that book is Unity, Diversity, and the Church at its Best. Now, why was that book so important? You see, I listened to that book and I got a copy to read because of my upcoming sermon series. If you're not a preacher, you might not understand this, but you're always thinking about the sermon that's coming or the series that is coming. And so I got it as a way to just get it was one of the books I'm reading to get my head around the issue of race and ethnicity and the church. And I would highly commend it to you. If you're interested in the subject, if you're interested in the church's perspective, a gospel perspective on race and multi-ethnic churches and that kind of thing, I'd recommend you get a copy and start reading it. Maybe even finish before we start the sermon series, which I believe is May 23rd. And which leads to the question some people have already asked. I announced a few weeks ago that I will be preaching a sermon series entitled, at least right now, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, about race and ethnicity and mission and things in the context of the church. Why am I doing that? And the answer, a lot of people immediately think, because if you're American, you're so politically minded these days, people are so divided, they think, oh, Tommy's doing this because of George Floyd, or Tommy's doing this because of just all the race issues, or someone accused me of becoming woke, whatever that means. And, let me tell you why. We are going to be doing a 15-part series on race and ethnicity. For one thing, it's all over the Bible. The hardest thing for me to do, to put this sermon series together, was to figure out what I should not talk about. I could have done easily 50 sermons on race and ethnicity. It is all over the Bible. In fact, the whole New Testament is about it. It's about Jesus, which we're going to be looking at race and ethnicity through the lens of Jesus, but it's all over. So it is an issue. And to not talk about it would be irresponsible. The bigger issue is our community. You see, in our community, we just had a demographic study done. We're having a session retreat this weekend to talk about that and things like it. And two big things came up in that demographic study that we sort of already knew. The first thing is according to 2019 data. So it's 2 years behind. Our community within a 10 to 15 minute drive of our church is 57% minority. In other words, if you are white in in Kent, you are in the actual minority now. So the nations are here in Kent, and I would say it might be up to 60% now. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that we're 57% minority, but we're also 57% people who are under 40 years old. Neither of those two groups are incredibly represented in our church. You see, the reason that we need to talk about it is because, we're coming out of COVID, and it's an opportunity to think about, okay, what does the church need to be doing now? And from the day I got here, if you know me, the church needs to be preaching the gospel to those in our immediate vicinity. And those in our immediate vicinity happen to be from every people, tongue, and tribe. Again, so I feel like if we are going to move forward as a church, it would be irresponsible for me not to talk about the issue of race, ethnicity, and mission. And what does it mean to be a church for the nations? What does it mean to be a church for many different kinds of people instead of one monocultural expression of the church? Will we pull it off? I don't know. Will this sermon series be the preaching equivalent of Tommy kicking the hornet's nest? I imagine some days it will feel like that. Either way, I'd ask you to pray for me and to be thinking about it and to even be doing reading. And just to give you some idea of my mindset going into this sermon series, I read a book probably about a month ago called From Every People and Nation by a professor named Hayes. And the subtitle is A Biblical Theology of Race. And here's how I explained it to my wife. When I was in the Army, I went to Halo School. That's free fall parachuting school. That's high altitude, low opening. You jump out at about 18,000 feet. You pull your parachute at 3,000 feet. Anywhere above 10,000 feet, you're liable to get hypoxia. And they want you to know what that feels like. So at some point about the middle of Halo School, we went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and they put you in a hyperbaric chamber and they remove the oxygen. And every person has different symptoms of oxygen deprivation or hypoxia. For me, it literally, the world turned black and white, like as if I was looking at a black and white television. And so I knew that. And when I took oxygen, I would take a hit of oxygen and wham! The color would come back to the world. It was amazing. That is what I felt like when I was reading the book, From Every People and Nation. In other words, it's as if I've been just reading the Bible in black and white. And as I read that book and realized what God had been doing in the world since the very beginning, it was like, whoom, it was like the color started to come back. And that God has been using people from every tribe, tongue, and nation to build his kingdom from the very beginning. In other words, I think we tend to believe okay, God chose this predominantly white nation, Israel, and then they produced Jesus, and then Jesus said, go out and tell all the people of color about me. When you really look at the Bible, it was multicultural, multi-ethnic, multicolored from the very beginning. And so that's the kind of thing I want to talk about. I want to encourage us. I want to get us excited about what God is doing in the world, and even start casting a vision for our church to start looking more and more like the Bible says we're going to look in the book of Revelation. So all of that said, we look forward to seeing you this weekend. And I can't wait to be back in the pulpit again, which I will be back in the pulpit again on Mother's Day. And on Mother's Day, I will be talking about passing on the faith. So I love you, I miss you, and look forward to seeing you this weekend in church if you're able to make it. Pastor Tommy